Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Mass Literacy Language Development with Dr. Sonia Cabell. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. This webinar is being recorded, and if you have any questions during the webinar, please use the Q&A function, and we will have time at the end to address some questions. There's also will be a brief survey at the end. If you wouldn't mind giving us some feedback there, that would be great. And it's also another place that you could add in any questions that you didn't get a chance to ask. Just to let you know, there is also a closed caption feature at the bottom of your screen if you would like to use that. This is webinar number 4 in our series of webinars that have featured prominent researchers in the field of literacy. Next up, we have the Mass Literacy Getting Started series. And Donna, if you wouldn't mind dropping the flyer registration into the chat for this webinar series. This will be a series of 6 sessions that will support users for assessing specific areas of the Mass Literacy Guide. It will feature experienced educators speaking to their use of evidence-based practices. And again, it will to help access specific areas of the Mass Literacy Guide. Our agenda for today: my name is Susan Kazeroid, if you don't know who I am, and I'm sorry for the sticky tongue this afternoon. I will be performing the role of MC for the afternoon. Very shortly, I will be turning it over to Dr. Sonia Cabell, who will be our featured speaker, who we are so excited to hear from. And then Donna Goldstein, my colleague, will be making some connections to the Mass Literacy Guide website. And we will end our day with the director of the Office of Literacy and Humanities, Catherine Tarka, who will be presenting some questions to Dr. Cabell. Mass literacy is a statewide effort to empower educators with the evidence-based practices for literacy that all students need. Evidence-based instruction provided within schools and classrooms that are culturally responsive and sustaining will put our youngest students on a path towards literacy for life. As part of mass literacy over the next several years, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education will offer literacy programming paired with implementation supports, including resources, professional development, and grants. Here you see a screenshot of the Mass Literacy landing page. You can see in the middle, we have a video which features classroom teachers, specialists, and a couple of the researchers who advised us on the guide. Many voices, perspectives, and areas of expertise contributed to this work. The featured speakers in this video were among the 100+ stakeholders who advised on this work. We engaged with research advisors from across the country and even internationally. Massachusetts preschool and elementary teachers, administrators, and ed prep faculty. DESE also partnered with the Massachusetts Reading Association, and we collaborated with the Mass Association of School Administrators, where we worked with a group of assistant superintendents. And now, I'd like to welcome Dr. Sonia Cabell, who is an assistant professor in the School of Teacher Education and the Florida Center for Reading Research at Florida State University. She has previously worked as a second grade teacher and a literacy coach. Dr. Cabell's research focuses on early language and literacy instruction with a particular interest in preventing reading difficulties among children living in poverty. Dr. Cabell has authored over 50 publications, including peer review articles, a book chapters, and early childhood language and literacy curricula. She currently serves as associate editor for the scholarly journal Early Childhood Research Quarterly. Dr. Cabell has served as principal investigator or co-principal investigator on grant projects totaling approximately $6 million. You can also follow her on Twitter at Sonia Cabell. And without any further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and welcome Dr. Sonia Cabell. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm so excited to be here today. All right. Um, I just wanted to say that I just wanted to begin by saying thank you so much for having me. I love Massachusetts. Massachusetts is near and dear to my heart. I began my journey at Smith College in Massachusetts in Northampton, where I studied to become a teacher. So I love the state of Massachusetts and so excited to be here. You probably recognize the simple view of reading. R equals D times C. R is about the reading comprehension, and D is really about fluent word reading. C is about language comprehension, and it's also referred to as linguistic or listening comprehension. And so today, it's the language comprehension side that we're focused on, when a person hears a text read aloud and understands what it means. Some people think of the primary grades as years when children are learning to read, and the elementary grades as years when children are reading to learn. But instruction in language comprehension cannot wait until decoding is already in place. We must think about how to foster comprehension during the earliest years. So how do we foster language comprehension? Well, we first need to understand the skills and the knowledge that contribute to language comprehension. This image is from the Mass Literacy website. It's another way to depict the simple view. When you think about language comprehension, you think about vocabulary and morphology, knowledge, syntax and grammar, and higher level language skills. These are all contributors to language comprehension. And for students experiencing reading difficulties, vocabulary and knowledge and higher level language skills are underlying causes of comprehension difficulties. This image is also from the Mass Literacy website. I'm going to talk about the language skills here as academic language skills. So what are academic language skills? So academic language is the formal communication structure and words that are common in books and at school. So it's the language of books and school. And it's the academic language skills are the skills that then enable a student to use and comprehend academic language. These skills include inferential language, which is the ability to discuss topics beyond the here and now. Narrative language skills, which is the ability to relate series of events, either fiction or nonfiction. And then academic vocabulary knowledge, the words you know, how many words, the breadth, but also how deeply you know the words, the depth in both expressive and receptive modalities. Another way to think about this is as the difference in language used in speech as to that used in books. So the difference between spoken and written language. And you can see this illustrated when we think about the words used in children's books. These have so many, a children's book, even the simplest book you might read to a preschool child, has so many more instances of rare words than our discussions that we have as college graduates with each other. So for literacy learning, it's really important to engage children in the language of books so that they can understand how written language works. And these are the kinds of words that students have to be able to read and understand on their own by the end of third grade. And these aren't words that we normally use in everyday conversation. At least I don't use these words in everyday conversation. And the texts that students read in K2 settings on their own usually don't contain words like these. So where are students going to get exposure to these kinds of words, this kind of vocabulary, unless someone reads aloud to them complex text regularly? Now let's switch gears here for a minute. We discussed language, now let's talk about knowledge. I'm going to read this passage to you. Customarily, 6 to 8 ushers create the arch. The ushers may be commissioned officers from different branches of service and thus in different uniforms. If that many ushers are not needed, other military guests may be asked in advance to assist the ushers in performing the service. Do you understand this passage? Do you really know what it's saying? You might understand all the words. And some of you might know what this is, if you had the right background knowledge. You're right if you said the Arch of Sabers ceremony immediately following a military wedding. And here's my wedding picture from 1998. And yes, there is such a thing as the Army Wife Handbook. I think it was the first handbook I ever owned. So we use our background knowledge to read text. Our background knowledge about a particular topic helps us make inferences and fill in the gaps, and helps us to integrate new knowledge that we learn with the knowledge we already have to achieve a deeper level of comprehension. When we don't have background knowledge for a given text, we have a lot of trouble understanding or learning from it. So when we think about the contributors to language comprehension, while we most often think about language, vocabulary, syntax, morphology, the things that go into language and academic language, we have to remember that background knowledge that a person brings to a text, which often includes knowledge, content knowledge of the social and natural world, is also essential to understanding the important role in reading comprehension. In fact, some people think about vocabulary as the tip of the iceberg of a person's conceptual knowledge. So the idiom tip of the iceberg basically means a small part of a much larger problem or situation that we can't really see, or that remains hidden, right? So vocabulary is what we can see, but we don't know the knowledge base from which students understand the vocabulary. It makes sense that it's not just about children's vocabulary, but it's also about their knowledge. And so intentionally and strategically building that knowledge may actually accelerate language learning. Reading instruction has been traditionally disconnected from building knowledge in science and social studies. And at the same time, content area instruction often receives a short shrift in the early grades in terms of instructional time. And that's not the fault of teachers. But one way curriculum developers and large districts in the US have been approaching this problem is through implementing content-rich English language arts instruction. While this is not a replacement for science and social studies instruction, it presents one way to infuse content area learning into literacy instruction. So what do I mean by content-rich English language arts instruction? We do have promising research to show that integrating content area instruction with language learning may be an optimal way to improve vocabulary and comprehension in the elementary grades. And one reason for this might be that content area instruction helps teachers facilitate richer academic language use and employ strategies like language modeling that improve children's language. We examined what these successful approaches that were seeking to integrate content area instruction into ELA learning had in common. And learning from research-based approaches we have found that have found success in improving children's outcomes, these are the key features that these approaches entail. Using content-rich interactive read-alouds. Using conceptually rich coherent text sets on a topic to build knowledge in a logical sequence. Explicitly teaching relationships among words, engaging students in discussion before, during, and after the interactive read aloud, and engaging students in writing to build knowledge. The idea here is to leverage literacy instruction to cumulatively learn content. So, in terms of content-rich interactive read-alouds, language develops through high-quality interactions between adults and children. So in the classroom, between teachers and students, high-quality conversational interactions need to be taking place. It's important to have rich conversations with students where they are active participants, and read-alouds are important vehicles for facilitating rich conversations. Research shows that the extra textual talk during read-alouds is related to improved language learning. That's the talk that's beyond the text itself. And this talk can occur before, during, or after the read aloud. In addition, these kinds of read alouds are generally more syntactically complex than the student's current reading level. To expose them to a more complex syntax and vocabulary they might not be seeing in their text that they're currently reading. In addition, informational texts, including informational narrative texts, appear to be influential they appear to facilitate inferential questions. So the actually informational text influence the kinds of questions teachers pose. They tend to pose more complex questions while using informational text. And finally, using coherent text sets or books that are related to one another that systematically build children's knowledge, it seems to be an important part of these content-rich interactive read-alouds, and they span across different genres. It doesn't have to be all informational text. So let me give you an example of a coherent text sets that span across different genre and build knowledge. So this first book, Growing Vegetable Soup, talks about what do plants need and how can we help plants. This second book, Plants in the Spring, adds on to it, how can plants help us? The third book, How a Seed Grows, talks about how different plants and animals help us in different ways. And finally, The Great Kapok Tree, the fourth book, how do plants and animals help each other? Why should we grow plants? So you can see these are both fiction, nonfiction, and narrative informational. And you can order these texts to be logically build content knowledge. In fact, several curricular approaches try to do this. And research shows that students use information from previously read books to understand new books. For example, after reading that birds need different materials to build different nests, students better understood a book about threats to bird survival. That was from a study by Gina Cervetti and colleagues in 2016. These books also provide repeated exposure to semantically related vocabulary words, that is, words that are linked semantically to a concept. And that brings us to our next recommendation, is explicitly teaching relationships among words. Because language and knowledge are related, conversations that build knowledge about science and social studies topics can also accelerate language skills. For example, if students are knowledgeable about plants, they're likely to know the meanings of words such as stems and roots. And a person who's knowledgeable about dinosaurs may understand the meaning of related words like omnivore, carnivore, and herbivore. That's an example from my son. He knows those fancy words, as do probably many 5-year-olds who like dinosaurs. Because when you read books about dinosaurs, that's what it talks about. This is an example of explicitly teaching relationships among words taken from the textproject.org. And among these words are both general purpose and content specific words. So I'm not just talking about only teaching content specific words, but also, which some call tier 3 types of words, but I'm also talking about what some label as tier 2, or those general purpose words that give you high mileage that students will see again and again across texts. So in addition, engaging students in discussion during these read alouds and in terms of content, not only before, during, and after read alouds, but also at other times of the day, is connecting students' prior learning to new learning, not just activating student learning or background knowledge. We spend a lot of time sometimes activating background knowledge, but consider if someone doesn't necessarily have background knowledge to activate. What then? If you can do all the activation you want, but if a student doesn't have the knowledge to understand the text, you have to build that knowledge. And so when engaging in discussion, eliciting students' contributions by asking open-ended questions is a strategy that helps build children's language. Asking children inferential questions actually elicits inferential responses from children. And discussion after a book reading is related to expressive vocabulary development. So not only asking open-ended questions, but also extending on what students say, building on students' ideas is another research-based strategy. Here's an example from the Foundational Skills to Support Reading for Understanding, the IES Practice Guide. There is a link in the Mass Literacy website to this particular resource. But this is an example of a transcript of a conversation occurring during ReadAlouds where the teacher encourages inferential language use, but also is trying to build children's knowledge. This book is about cheetahs. Cheetahs are a kind of cat. They are actually a type of wildcat. Wildcats are different from the cats we have as pets in our homes. I have a cat. Is your cat a wildcat or a pet? She's my pet. Yes, if your cat lives in your house, she is a pet. How would you describe your cat? She is gray. She is nice and soft. Okay, so you would describe your cat as gray, nice, and soft. Can you put the question and answer together in one sentence? The question was, how would you describe your cat? So your answer should start with, I would describe my cat as gray, nice, and soft, and she likes to catch birds. Well, that's one way wildcats are similar to pet cats we have at home. They both like to catch things. What are some ways wildcats might be different from cats that are our pets? Wildcats are wild. Well, that's true. What makes wildcats seem wild? You can't pet them. Can you put the question and answer together in one sentence? The question was, what makes wildcats seem wild? Wildcats seem wild because you can't pet them. Good. And they don't eat cat food. They probably don't live inside. Exactly. Wildcats are wild. As wild animals, they don't like human contact. They catch their own food and they live in the wild. And finally, engaging students in writing to build knowledge is another important strategy. So this example comes from an article by James Kim and colleagues in 2020, where they look at an intervention they call MORE. Providing students with opportunities to use writing as a tool for extending new concepts is important. For example, after researching the survival of Arctic animals on a unit talking about Arctic animal survival, students researched their own animal, and then they wrote an argumentative piece about, could you survive in the Arctic? And these were first graders, okay? And they used the tree strategy for writing, which is writing a topic sentence, providing reasons for their opinion, examining each reason from the audience perspective, and providing an ending. So to summarize, we need to support language comprehension in the primary grades. And to do this effectively, we need to facilitate students' learning of both academic language skills and knowledge. And one research-based way to do this is to consider content-rich English language arts approaches that integrate knowledge and language. This can be done by using content-rich interactive read-alouds, using coherent text sets that are conceptually related on a topic, explicitly teaching relationships among words, and engaging students in discussion and in writing in order to build knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cabell, and we'll hear from you in a few more minutes. Right now, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Donna Goldstein, who will share some resources from the Math Literacy Guide.
That sounds great. Thank you, Susan. Thank you as well, Dr. Cabell. It was really interesting. I am going to share my screen right now. So if you just bear with me for one moment. Here it is. So given everything that Dr. Cabell has spoken about in terms of language comprehension, vocabulary, and knowledge, and she took us through the skills for early reading section of the guide. I also wanted to call your attention to the choice of text to use with students and how this becomes a very important consideration. I'm going to take you to another part of the guide where you can also find resources that support a lot of what Dr. Cabell spoke about. So we're going to go to the components of the core literacy block. We're going to go right where this yellow band is. As a component of the core literacy block, a lot of the work to be done is around engaging with complex text. I'm going to select the choosing and using complex text page here. So first of all, this opens with a really excellent headshot of Dr. Cabell, along with a quote from her speaking to the importance of high quality instruction as an equity issue, and daily access to grade level complex text is a critical part of high quality core instruction. Below this, within choosing and using complex text, there are sections that address what complex text is, and we here link to a DESE quick reference guide around text complexity and the growth of reading comprehension. So it explains what text complexity is, how it's ascertained, and gives lots of useful information to the field around that. Just going to go back onto the page. So in addition to explaining what complex text is, there's also information here, importantly, around building vocabulary and knowledge that Dr. Cabell spoke to. Also supporting students to use comprehension strategies with complex texts, resources for developing knowledge and vocabulary using text sets. So I think you can see many, many connections here. Additionally, and importantly, within this page, just going to scroll briefly up, we have a direct link right here to the vocabulary and knowledge page within a section that is for students experiencing reading difficulty. So this is a section that wasn't necessarily highlighted by Dr. Cabell, but we wanted to bring to your attention because it, again, reinforces the concepts that she had spoken with. And here on this page, you'll find information and supports for students who struggle with reading comprehension and for whom vocabulary and knowledge may be the barriers. Also, the academic language that Dr. Cabell spoke to is explained thoroughly here with lots of details around that information. So while I know it's a quick tour, I appreciate you joining me on that. I encourage you to revisit the guide to learn more, and I'm going to turn it back to Susan now for some question and answer with Dr. Cabell. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Donna. I am now going to turn it over to Catherine Tarka, who's the Director of the Office of Literacy and Humanities. And I believe she has some questions for Dr. Cabell.
Yes, thank you so much for being here with us today, Dr. Cabell, sharing your knowledge and the results of your research, which I was so excited to see included. So I've got a couple of questions for you gleaned from the chat. And I want to start with assessment. So a lot of educators here in Massachusetts and nationwide are rethinking assessment for early literacy. We're making moves towards valid and reliable screening for skills like phonological awareness and phonics. But what about assessing language comprehension in our young learners? And if I can add one more wrinkle to that, I'd love to hear your recommendations around language comprehension assessment for native English speakers, as well as children whose native language is not English.
Oh, I wish Dr. Paez was here for that question. Yeah, so I think this is a hard one because I think that it has historically been very hard to develop language screeners that can be easily administered and a widespread use. Not the diagnostic kinds of tools that SLPs use. We have a lot of valid and reliable tests in that, but it's been historically difficult, and it varies by state greatly as to what is used. Some states do not include the language portions. I would say I'm not familiar with anyone kind of including the knowledge portions appropriately because it's very hard to do that. The question becomes, which knowledge do you put on there? What topics do you put on a screener? And so I don't know that I have a great answer to this question. I do know that some states I think Florida is one of them, and Texas one of them and I would love to hear more about whether Massachusetts is one of them that has developed their own kinds of language screeners that have been used in the state. But I wouldn't be able to say that I would recommend just one. I do know that my colleagues Yakov Petcher and Hugh Katz at Florida Center for Reading Research have been working on developing more comprehensive screeners that would help young children. So that being said, I think it's very difficult, and I also think it's difficult to parse. Then I think the question was around Spanish assessments, and again, I think that I'm not necessarily knowledgeable of all the assessments that are in Spanish. There's a lot of assessments that are valid that are used by researchers and that are used by specialists for diagnostic purposes. But in terms of screening, I think that's a much more difficult and open question.
Yes, thank you for that. And I want to use that as a jumping off point to talk about a component of language that gets a little bit less attention, which is syntax. We looked at earlier in your presentation on the Mass Literacy Guide at the skills for early reading. Vocabulary is on there. That's really familiar to most educators as a component of instruction, but syntax is a major component of language comprehension. It's very less frequently discussed amongst teachers and in the training that we receive to teach literacy. So can you talk a little bit about how we help young children develop their syntax and language skills?
Yes. So yes, syntax is very important. I think that there's some things, and I think people tend to think about syntax as maybe less malleable than changing vocabulary knowledge. However, there are things we can do to enhance syntax, and I think one thing that relates to the presentation today and to the Mass Literacy website is around exposure to complex texts that are beyond the grade level in which students are reading, because it's not just about syntax that's used in everyday speech. It's about the language of written language, the language of text, which is quite different than the language that we use, both in its vocabulary and in its syntax. And by syntax, I'm talking about the way words are put together to form the language structures that we have. And it's very different to write something than it is to talk about something. And so making sure children are immersed in different kinds of books, different kinds of texts at higher levels than what they're able to read. And so I would continue to expose children to those kinds of syntax structures that are found. There's some syntax structures that are found more in informational texts that you maybe wouldn't see in storybooks, and vice versa.
Thank you for that. And your emphasis on complex text with different text structures and language structures is so important for us to be reminded of. And I wanted to ask you about the advice you gave around conducting interactive read-alouds. So almost every classroom teacher that I've ever worked with, and when I was a classroom teacher, read aloud is a part of what we do. But doing the read aloud in the way that you described is complex and is sometimes requires some changes in practice from perhaps a traditional read aloud. So can you address perhaps pitfalls or challenges or maybe updates that need to be made from a traditional read aloud to the type of read aloud that really supports language development as you're recommending it?
Yes, that's a great question. I think, yes, I think read alouds are ubiquitous, right? We all know to do read alouds and we all do them regularly. I think some of the things are probably small tweaks in what teachers are already doing well. Some might be larger tweaks, but let's talk about choosing the books. So I talked about teaching in coherent text sets to build both language and knowledge. The coherent text set idea is pairing books or using a set of 4 books or so or more to build knowledge incrementally on a particular topic. So students are hearing the same concepts again and again. So part of it is in the planning of what will I read aloud. I know when I was a second grade teacher many moons ago, I used to just choose my favorite books that I wanted to read aloud, that children loved, and I loved reading them aloud. There's nothing wrong with reading aloud to children books that you love, but I think you could still do that and be deliberate about building knowledge at the same time, and language at the same time. Those weren't things that, when I was in classrooms about 20 years ago, that I was paying attention to at all. But I think those are things that teachers are now paying attention to. Also, thinking about there's a lot of research on the text, the extra textual talk, all the talking and conversation that goes around the actual text itself. So both before, during, and after, there is things that you might say, conversations that you might have. Now, this isn't to say you want to interrupt every page of a text that you're reading. There is a balance, and different approaches and curricula approach these things differently. But I think that that during reading is a good time to stop and discuss vocabulary in child-friendly, give a vocabulary definition in very child-friendly terms, and go on at the point of when you reach that word. It's a time to discuss, to really mention concepts. And then after reading is a time to really discuss and ask children inferential questions, not only literal recall questions, but also inferential questions. And then before reading is a time to connect their prior learning to the new learning. In addition, I'm not, in saying these things, I'm not minimizing the role of comprehension strategies, explicit teaching of comprehension strategies, because we do know that there is research that supports the explicit use of reading comprehension strategies to aid reading comprehension.
Yes, thank you for mentioning that. And we have a couple of great references around that on the Mass Literacy Guide as well. So a question that we received in the chat is about balance. We've focused today on the language comprehension, quote unquote, side of the equation. And we've talked in recent webinars about the fluent word reading components of early reading. So we know that children in the early grades need explicit and systematic instruction on their foundational skills. They also, equally importantly, need this exposure to complex text and chances to discuss it and develop their language. Are there any tips or tricks to balancing the two?
So this is an interesting question, because it's also invokes the how much should I be doing of each type of thing. And I can't say that there is great research around how much instruction. Like, we all know that instruction in foundational skills or phonics instruction is essential to children. It's essential to some children. Some children might implicitly pick up the code, but it's important to instruct all children in the code, and explicitly and systematically. However, your whole instructional time shouldn't be spent doing that. It should be, you should also, I hesitate to use the word balanced, so I'm going to avoid that word, okay? But you should also be able to have the, richness that comes around building children's comprehension. And at first, in the early grades, these kind of feel a bit separate, and curricula also conceptualize them as separate. And by the time a child is in third grade, these start merging. The books that they're reading might also build the knowledge more. So curricula do this in different ways, and they put that balance differently. However, I think that a lot of people subscribe to the 45 minutes to an hour in foundational skills and an hour in the other as well. And let's not forget writing, and make sure that we're properly writing. So I know that Massachusetts recommends certain timing, but I think it's really important that the message is not one or the other, or let's forget about writing. All of these things are needed to build literacy in a child. And even those that are doing well in the code are not hindered from having code-related instruction, just they're strengthened from that.
Yes, and we know that the evidence base around both sides of the reading equation is very strong. The evidence around language development, how to promote that, as well as the evidence around systematic and explicit instruction to support fluent word reading are both critical areas that are based upon scientific evidence. So thank you for illuminating that. I want to turn to one more question from the chat that was about families, and an educator who works with families around supporting literacy development asked if there are particular strategies that could be shared with families around promoting academic language development.
I think it's really important to remember that families, as you're working with families, it's very important for us to remember all of the cultural knowledge and everything that they bring to the table, because nobody has no knowledge, right? Nobody has no language. So thinking about what is the kind of funds of knowledge that the families have, and how can we build on those, sometimes those funds of those the language and things like that don't necessarily look like the language of school. But I think one thing that we often see in family and home life, that you might see in your own home life, is sometimes as parents, we find ourselves talking at our children and not talking with our children. And I remember when my sister-in-law had this aha moment about, you know, I don't really, we don't really have back and forth conversations, my young child and I. My husband and I talk to each other, but not really with him. And so that aha moment, you know, you want parents to be able to realize we have a lot of things competing. We have screens competing, we have, and parents don't realize sometimes those importance, and really well-educated parents as well, don't realize the importance of those daily interactions and those conversations, even when before children are speaking, the narrating, the talking with the child, taking turns back and forth, and then stressing the importance of reading aloud, and you know, and providing experiences to the child and talking about those. So I couldn't stress more the importance of conversations in the home, particularly when a lot of our lives are filled up with television.
Thank you so much for that. And I'm really glad we had the opportunity to highlight that asset-based perspective because that was our last question. So it's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you so much again for sharing your expertise. And I'm going to turn it back to Susan to wrap us up.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Thank you, Dr. Cabell. We so appreciate you joining us today, and to all of you out there, thank you for joining us. This last slide here has contact information for Donna, myself, and Catherine at the department. If you're interested in, you're welcome to reach out to us. I want to thank you all for joining us today, and for those of you who joined us for the whole series, thank you so much, and stay tuned for what's next to come.